TAB Media special report featuring an update on the work of the SBC Sexual Abuse Task Force. I'm your host, Jennifer Rash. Joining me as co-host is TAB Media staff member Margaret Colson. And with us from the task force is Chairman Bruce Frank, pastor of Biltmore Baptist Church in Arden, North Carolina, and Vice Chairman Marshall Blalock, pastor of First Baptist Charleston in South Carolina. Thank you both for taking some time with us today.
Thank you.
Okay, as a quick summary for our listeners, the Sexual Abuse Task Force has a one-year assignment coming out of the June 2021 SBC annual meeting. Messengers asked for a review of the SBC Executive Committee's handling of sexual abuse allegations between January 1, 2000 and June 14, 2021. The 7-member task force was named in July and engaged a third-party firm, Guidepost Solutions, right away. Guidepost will share its findings with the task force in mid-May 2022, and the task force will then release those findings publicly within 1 week. Recommendations for changes in convention policies and procedures also will be presented prior to the upcoming annual meeting in June. Links to more details on the background will be available in the show notes, so that today we can focus on talking about the work that has been done the past 6 months and what the remaining 4 months look like. All right, how was that for an executive summary?
Very good, very good, very concise.
All right. Well, Bruce, walk us through these past 6 months and what all of this has looked like for the task force members.
6 months, I'll be the concise one. Obviously it was an interesting beginning. First of all, I would say, President Litton put together a wide background of individuals, and most of us didn't know each other beforehand. Marshall and I had a number of good acquaintances with each other, but I think one of the more remarkable things is the way that God has provided a lot of cohesiveness with the team, built trust fairly quickly, coming from different backgrounds. And there's a lot of, folks there from, attorneys to advocates. And so majority of people did not know each other. And so, part of it was getting to know each other initially, but it's been a delight in that regard to get to know, folks like Marshall and, Rachel and Andrew and just the whole group. Couldn't speak more highly of them. And then obviously it took a little bit longer to get started than we had hoped and planned to work through with getting what the messengers had asked the team to do. But eventually it was done, and Guidepost is hard at work, and feel very confident in their ability to provide a very thorough report that'll help out the SBC and, to be as good and godly of an organization as we can.
Let me jump in on that. Yeah, you alluded to it didn't get started as quickly as you'd hoped. To tell us a little bit about that.
Well, what I'm referring to is, the little bit of the not, having to work through doing the, attorney-client privilege, those things that were really clear in the motion. And then, with the Nashville meeting and then the subsequent Zoom meetings, but very grateful for the way it turned out. Probably it took a month, but again, Guidepost is a big firm. They're able to make up time. But again, those meetings were a little eye-opening. But again, very grateful for the folks on the team, as well as the Jared Wellmans and the Dean and Sarahs and a number of those folks that really just made sure we did the right thing. It just took a little bit longer with the executive committee to get where the messengers told us to go.
So from your perspective, either one of you, so far from what you can tell, what difference has that very challenging decision to waive the attorney-client privilege, what difference has that made in the ability to collect information or conduct interviews and that sort of thing?
Marshall, I'll make a couple comments and then feel free to do that. But when Margaret, when you look at it, it's a third-party independent investigation. So while we do have updates with Guidepost to see, how things are going, we do not, get into specifics. We know that, that they are being, very, very thorough with that, but we don't get into the specifics of what they are finding at this point. That's the part of the reason it being a third-party, independent investigation. And so the fact they can just go, look specifically at the executive committee's, the things that are pertinent, I think the safe assumption is that they're able to see things that they would not have been able to see if that had not been passed. And I think some of that will be much more easy to see come May than we can see right now. Because again, they're providing an independent report, but I think it's safe to say the fact that they can go in and, because again, the whole thing was to open up it was to open up the books. It got characterized by, phrases like blanket waiver and some of these things that really were not as accurate as they should have been, or took a little while to show what it is and what it's not. And really what it was is just to be able to go and see how the EC is handled when it's gotten up to the EC level, and not say, well, we can't look at that. We need to have a clean look at it, and we're confident that's what's happening. Marshall, is that, I know I sounded like a politician there, trying to answer and not answer at the same time, but
I wasn't going to say anything.
I'll go one step further on the politician side. There were well-meaning people who didn't believe it was in the best interest of the executive committee or the convention to waive privilege. There were well-meaning people. We met with Bruce and I and a couple of others met to negotiate one of the steps along the way with the executive committee. And those folks are good people. They didn't agree with us in large measure, but they were good people trying to do the right thing. So I think people could see it different ways. But in the end, the question was, are we going to do what the messengers ask us to do? And I think that's the prevailing piece to it. And part of the problem with this whole situation was we had law firms telling us one thing, they had a law firm telling them something else. And in the end, we had to decide, do we want to listen to the messengers, and do we want to do all we could to be faithful to the people who may have been hurt in all this? And in the end, the executive committee members voted to do what they were asked to do. And we believe they made a good decision. And as Bruce said, what it does is it makes the investigation actually meaningful. Because one of the conversations that we had with the law firm, they no longer have working for them now, is that they were going to fight over every document. Well, that you can't do what needs to be done. That wasn't the spirit of the executive committee members. Even they were being represented by people who were not really representing their interests well, in my view. So to have the whole thing, to actually find the facts and get to the truth, and then find a way to do what God wants us to do with that truth, the waiver of privilege made that necessary. And I'm grateful that so far all we know is the cooperation level has been exactly what we'd hoped it would be.
Well, when all of this was starting up, I couldn't get my head around how you get started. I mean, where do you start with January 1, 2000 through June 14, 2021? I mean, where are those allegations? How do you know where they are? How do you get, what did y'all do? What was or what did Guidepost do, I guess, really?
Well, and again, Marshall, we can tag team on this. The good Guidepost is one of the few that they have a lot of resources, whether that be staff, experts in this. And obviously with 20 years, every detail is not going to be able to be covered. You could spend 3 times that amount of time. But I think being experts, they'll know which threads to pull, or patterns to pursue. If they see, okay, here's a pattern of not dealing with this correctly, or here's a pattern if it was dealing with correctly, because there were some, there's some good people who tried to do it and who tried to do things the right way. But again, there'll be some things they don't, you can't uncover every single thing in over a 20-year period, but they're very good at what they do. And they let us know they felt they could do a very thorough report. Even after the delay, they felt they could do a very thorough report, and they still feel that way. But the clock was ticking the entire time because of that time frame. But we're confident that by May there'll be a very thorough report that will be credible. I think what Marshall was alluding to, that's not the main thing. The main thing is to do the right thing, but the credibility of the report is important. And without being able to open up the book, so to speak, that would have lacked credibility to the survivors, to your normal person, as well as, one of the things we had to bicker over a little bit was, being able to edit the report when it came out, those kind of things. And those were just non-starters, because that was clearly A, not what the messengers wanted, and B, would not have credibility in any, organization. And for a nonprofit like Southern Baptist Convention is, your credibility and your trustworthiness, is important. And obviously the main thing is to make sure we do, as best we can to anybody who was adversely affected in those years.
One of the biggest things we had to decide was what company would we get to do the investigation. And you'd be surprised how few companies could do what we were asking to do. But one of the things that was impressive to Bruce and the rest of the team about Guidepost was they went and they found people on their staff that were Baptist people that understood Baptist life. And there are 2 law firms they're employing that do this kind of work, that are headed up by Baptist people that are familiar with and work with survivors of sexual abuse. One of the people just recently graduated from Southeastern Seminary with a degree in counseling, who's also an attorney, also an investigator. These are just top quality people. We got to meet some of these folks, and we thought these folks are capable of doing this kind of investigation, and they understand who we are as a family of people. And that was a big factor in choosing them, besides the fact that they're credible and well known. But we felt like the people they chose and added to their staff to do what we asked them to do was a very impressive thing for us. So we believe that's important. The other piece that I want to suggest to really remind you of is we're not investigators. Our task force is not investigating anybody. We've asked them to do that, but we believed and we still believe, we have a responsibility to learn all we can and understand all we can about what's happened and these kind of things that take place. And for me, it made me, I had to read books. The team actually had interviews with survivors to help understand what's happened and how things take place. And our hearts were broken universally by some of the things we heard. I wish I didn't know the things I know today, but I'm grateful that God has put people along the way to help us to learn and see so we can do better about this. So we read Rachel Denholler's book. We read Krista Brown's book. We got several other books, different things. We had interviews with folks. So we're not investigating anything as far as that stuff goes, but we're learning about how sexual abuse has happened in churches, how difficult it is even for the survivors to report it. And then once they report it, how difficult it is to go through the process, and it's been mishandled so frequently. It's so sad. And so every one of our hearts are broken. So it's not that we didn't care before, but I think we have a much more personal understanding than we've ever had before.
For sure.
I understand, speaking of survivors, that Guidepost Solutions is not initiating contact with survivors, but you have provided a way for survivors to initiate the contact, to tell their stories to Guidepost. Two-part question. Number one, do you have any feel for how many survivors, if they're getting a good response to that? And then just for our listeners, if you could share how a survivor might initiate that process with Guidepost Solutions to tell their story.
You got it, Marshall.
Couple things on that. Some of our task force are counselors, and they have strong relationships with the survivor community, people that have gone through this and dealt with this. And so those relationships automatically were an opportunity for our task force members with personal contacts to say, that Guidepost is not going to call you, because that can come across as abusive too, just to go demand we want information from you. But those relationships were able to be capitalized on and say, look, we believe you can trust the Guidepost folks. They're trauma-informed counselors that know how to ask questions without doing even more harm than good, because that's another factor. Something I didn't even know about. You begin to ask questions, you can be well-meaning, ask the wrong question and do more harm than good. And so they were able to sort of broker those friendships and say, look, we believe this is a good opportunity for you to tell your story. And we know that there have been quite a number who have told their stories. But we know there are probably others who won't. And some who've told some of our people, I don't care what you say, I'm not going to talk to them. But we're hopeful that people will. And they've done all they can to sort of get the word out. And a lot of it's person to person, to suggest, hey, would you be willing to do an interview? And they'll give them the information. So it's really been done on a personal level.
And then
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Margaret, we're able to hear you. And she was asking, I think, about how people could still get into contact with Guidepost.
Our sex abuse task force website, we'll get that information to you in just a second.
Yeah, and I'll put that in as well.
It has the email address they can contact.
Mm-hmm.
It's also on the Guidepost, has a website for our investigation. You can go there and get it too.
Mm-hmm.
We should have had that.
No, I'll put that
in
the show notes so everybody can just link on to that. But yes, and let me jump there for a second. On that website you're providing is very helpful. You're keeping anyone who's interested up to date. You're doing the frequently asked questions. You're putting downloadable resources. Why did you think that was important to be as forthcoming and transparent and just willing to share as you have been? Because that is a little unusual for a type of situation like this.
I mean, Marshall, again, you can chime. I mean, I think that's always appropriate to be that. Now, it is as clear as can be, but even like Guideposts, there's certain things you don't share, obviously, like a survivor's name, those kind of things. But as far as just information, especially at the start of this, I think information is our friend. I mean, it's Marshall and I've talked just leadership principles in general. Facts are your friends, and you're trying to hear the facts. Here's what we're trying to do. There is no agenda other than trying to do what the messengers asked, and correctly asked, overwhelmingly asked to do. And so we decided early on, really as a team, is just communication. Because if you don't communicate, people come up with either other ideas or somebody can paint a narrative that's not accurate. So our deal was, as best we can, even if it's correspondence, if it doesn't, let's just get that out there. So that was sort of a ground rule that we all thought would be helpful. And I think it has been helpful for, the reasons you already mentioned. But I mean, I think that's the way Marshall's operated his ministry forever, just to be as open, as forthright. That's what I've tried to do it. And so it was sort of a natural overflow.
This made sense.
Let me tell you one thing about that, because when you see those publications go on our task force, everybody on the task force contributes to that.
Okay.
I think everybody on there has changed a sentence, added a sentence, or refigured a paragraph. It's a community effort.
Yep.
And I think it's stronger because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just one person writing it off for everybody. So it's a community effort. I really like that. And then, as Bruce mentioned at the very beginning, we had to decide what to do because there was no standard. Nobody told us what to do. And one of the debates we had to have at the very beginning was, how much do we tell about the inside baseball of all this? And it was clear to us early on, we needed to be as forthright and as clear and as transparent as we possibly could. And so we from the very beginning, if we sent something to the EC staff, we publicized it after they got it. We didn't do it ahead of time, but we wanted every communication to be clear, and we did it privately first, and then we publicized what we did. And we felt like that was the right thing to do. In the end, I think people were able to see exactly what happened and exactly when it happened. And I think that's important. If you got all these folks around the country who want to know what's happened, they can go right there and find it.
It's definitely a lot easier to keep everybody funneled into one place. That web address is sataskforce.net, sataskforce.net, and we'll put that in the show notes. But that has been helpful for all of us in communication and trying to tell the story. So we've appreciated your putting that out there. Margaret, let's see if we can hear you now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We
Yep.
got you. Go ahead.
Good. Okay, so the SBC messengers obviously voted in June for this task force to be initiated and for the investigation to begin. This past fall, several state conventions also made motions or resolutions to study sexual abuse response in their state conventions. Do you anticipate any overlap in what is being done nationally with what's being done in the numerous state conventions that are also looking into these allegations?
Yes, I think overlap. I think the more collaboration you can have and the more communication you can have. I mean, again, everybody, we're trying to get the best processes, not just for what has happened, but what will happen in the future to be, as safe and secure a place, all over 48,000 churches. And so there'll be some collaboration. Anytime you get that many entities trying to do similar things, you're going to have some overlap. But I think we're making some strides to be able to say, hey, here's what we're learning, because there is a learning curve. I think Marshall hit on it earlier. Unless you were a part of, I know I've learned, I feel like I've just barely scratched the surface, but I've read tons of, it's been a fast track learning curve since July or whenever that was. And I was very ignorant on virtually every aspect of this except the real basic ones. And so I think they're going to be starting off from the same place sometime. So there'll certainly be some communication. We're going to make some deliberate things to say, here's what we've learned, and try to make it as cohesive as we can. But of course, they've got their state things they've got to do as well. But has been and will be some communication to them to hopefully, again, best idea wins. And they're going to have some ideas that we might not have thought of, so that we'll probably get our heads together before June for sure.
We're actually working on the opportunity to perhaps have leaders from every state task force join us for at least a little while in a meeting, hopefully sometime in April. It's not in concrete yet, but we're hoping that happens so that we can, as Bruce said, learn from ideas we may not have thought of, but also help. If all of us are in one place together for just a little while, we may have some information that may be helpful. They may teach us something, but it cannot hurt to have all these state conventions want to do the same thing. And we believe that gives us an opportunity perhaps to see even more useful report from us, but also the state conventions as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, and they, their task force are, I believe, all tasked with bringing a report to the next state convention, which would, according on the state, would be either October or November. There's at least one state I remember reading about that said it was going to work on its report after it hears what your report is. So I thought that was interesting. So no pressure there. They're going to wait and see what you guys do. But it's all kind of playing out in this calendar year. The task force itself will go away, if I'm understanding correctly, will go away with the meeting in June, correct? As it is as far as this existence. But will the recommendations likely take the place of having to continually name a new task force or a new group? Do you think that will take care of itself?
I think, Marshall, why don't you answer that one? You know SBC resolutions and stuff better than I do, but the short answer would be yes. But Marshall, why don't you give the longer answer?
We don't know what it's going to look like yet. There's so much to learn so far. Second of all, I hope we don't go away in the sense of I'll just go away. Right. But as a task force, yes, our work completes in June at the convention. So we'll retire from that role then. But we hope that our report might produce some actionable motions. Mm-hmm. And we don't know if we have standing to present those motions, but we can certainly present our report and someone else can make the motion. The report likely will at least be sent to the EC before it goes anywhere else. So they may bring recommendations and motions that we don't have to bring. So we don't know exactly what the procedure will be, but we hope that what we are able to present is something that has some opportunity for the convention to say, this is what we plan to do based on this report. So it may have motions that we present or someone else presents, but we hope they're actionable items to actually do something to prevent sex abuse in our churches and in the convention, and then to deal rightly with it should it ever happen.
And I'm trying to get my head around the fact that the report will come to you from Guidepost mid-May. You'll have 1 week to then make it public with recommendations and all. So does that mean Guidepost will most likely be putting the recommendations, and then your task force will be deciding whether to take those or polish those or deal with those? Because 1 week is a short time to put all that together. So just curious how that's going to play out.
I mean, there'll be recommendation. It'll be more of a joint thing. They're working on it. We're working on recommendations. They're doing more of the investigatory part of that.
Yep.
So that's, but as far as recommendations, we've got obviously several meetings task force wise to make sure we have, here's what we've learned, here's what we think, here's, Guidepost certainly brings that expertise into it. They bring that. And so again, best idea wins, but yeah, we're working on some things, and Guidepost is certainly working on some things, and then the recommendations will be part of that.
And we're not averse to your readers and listeners saying, we've got an idea about how it may be helpful for the convention to operate. If there's an idea out there, we're not saying, don't tell us. We're actually saying, please do.
Sure.
Email Bruce.
All right.
And that was going to be my next question. You're reading my mind, Marshall. What can the Southern Baptist in the pew, who may or may not even go to Anaheim next year, but what can the Southern Baptist in the pew do to support the work of the task force over the next 4 months prior to the convention?
Well, we certainly need the Lord's leadership. We knew that from the very beginning. I think it's typical of Baptists to say, well, let's pray about it too. But we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that without the Lord's leadership on this, we've got no chance of producing anything of real value to the convention. So as you pray, please. And again, if you know someone who's a survivor that has a story to tell, maybe you could help that person to be able to make the email to say, I'm willing to talk. And maybe if you do have something you think this might be a way of helping our churches, it may be outside of our purview of what we're supposed to do, but if it's a good idea, it's a good idea. And who knows, it may be something that we could pass on to state conventions or somebody else. So if someone does have a thought about, here's how I think we could help do something that helps move the ball on this issue, we'd be certainly open to listening to it.
Yeah, and I would echo that. Just people have been praying. Especially when we got started, we talked about at one meeting how many people that you can tell if somebody's like, I'll pray for you, versus like, I've been fasting and praying for your team for the last week. I mean, those type of things that happened over and over and over again. And you could very much sense there were several times you're like, how's that going to work out? And the Lord just opened it up in a way that you couldn't have manufactured or made up. And so echo with Marshall, definitely be praying. I think secondly, the recommendations will come out, and I think as a church, they can look at it with their leadership. And I think on a specific way is once those are out, make sure their church is the safest, most secure spiritual place that there possibly can be, with their leaders. I mean, I'm sure their leaders are going to want to do it, but sometimes pastors get, just busy or trying to plug holes, and they just need to encourage that, hey, we're going to have the place that is a super safe place, is a grace-filled but super safe place for for our kids, for our teenagers, etc.
And this is not just a nice thing to do. This is biblically appropriate. It's the Bible wants us to protect the weak, and we can't just ignore this. I think it's a critical path for us if we're going to be gospel focused people. We've got to get this right. We can't mess this up.
Right.
Are you receiving any pushback outside of the initial figuring out the way we were going to do it all? Are you receiving any pushback or any indication that people might be fearful of actually dealing with this topic and dealing with all that it may bring to the surface?
Go ahead, Marshall. You can start.
Well, honestly, since the beginning, since the third vote, the pushback has gone sort of in the background. Honestly, we've not heard anything. I've not heard anything lately of pushback. There's always, I know this is probably going to be on social media. There's always some nonsense on social media outside of this particular forum, but nonetheless, it's been very little since the executive committee made the decision to go with the messenger model.
And I would say the same thing. It was a lot for a couple of months, and then now it's it's going on. So it's almost like, all right, that big hurdle. And then my anticipation would be, I mean, the proof will be in the pudding as far as when it in May and June, there's a potential, especially when you start in, recommendations of change. People don't like change, that much in general. And I think change is the one thing you definitely will be called on to do. So, it probably will ramp up a little bit, but like Marshall said, the last couple months, it's been a little bit more in the background than the foreground, like it was for the first month or so.
It's always said, Baptists hate two things: change and the way things are. So you may as well pick the right change. Right?
Yeah, true.
Well, that makes it a little difficult. Well, before we let you go, tell us how this has impacted each of you personally, maybe even the other team members, because this has had to be heavy on a lot of levels.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's such a emotional, and going into it, as I mentioned earlier, I was, except for the, obviously wanting to protect people and that kind of thing, those general things. I mean, just, the pain, the empathy, it's provided some clarity as well. It's like, just in the idea of being a protective, I mean, going back and just how gospel-centered it is to protect the vulnerable, that's been reestablished. It's affected me because I've met a lot of phenomenal people as well. People like Marshall, as well as survivors who have showed just amazing courage that if I were in their shoes, I would have quit, honestly. And they just had phenomenal faith and fortitude and stamina and grace. And it's, and my wife, she was assaulted when she was in junior high. So, so just learning, just being empathetic, trying to learn about what this whole thing has been, and sometimes overwhelming, because it is so heavy, and it's heavy because there's a lot of pain, and there's people's pain. And then you've got people that, obviously, who have done those things that, while you want to show grace, there's certainly anger, and you don't, and anyway, there's a lot of emotion stuff that has gone into it. But I'm glad, it's been a good journey when you have a team like Marshall and the rest of the folks. It's certainly, easier is the wrong word, but it's more of a team effort than, I can't imagine one person trying to do this versus a team. I think it would have crushed one person. And so that's why I go back to the survivors. I mean, it's like, because most of the time they were one person, and they at times had community, but they're the heroes. I mean, honestly, they're the ones that are just like, wow, that is just staggering, that their faith as well as their fortitude. So it is a privilege to try to find some degree of justice, as well as putting in processes that'll make it better and safer and protect the vulnerable. So it's been deeply impactful personally, as well as, anyway, there's a bunch of stories.
Right.
I agree 100% with Bruce, what Bruce is saying. couple things to add. One, I didn't know Bruce before these meetings, except by reputation. And one of the blessings that I think Baptists in general have had, not just our task force, but anybody that heard Bruce answer questions and speak in the executive committee meetings that they held, saw here's a man who loves the Lord and wants to stand on principle. And our task force has been well represented by his leadership and his voice. So I'm grateful for that. But also, as Bruce said, it's meeting people who are survivors and seeing their hearts and lives. It's made me understand them in ways I couldn't have understood before until this experience. But it's also made me realize how ignorant I have been for a lifetime, and how it's easy to ignore this issue. We can't do that. And I think our people have learned that from a very personal standpoint. One other piece that you may not know, one of our members is a counselor for sex abusers. And the wisdom of picking who President Litton picked, I'm glad he picked who he picked, because they're every one of them great folks. But to have a counselor for the people who do this was brilliant, because he's taught us things we could never have learned any other way. So this task force has been a blessing to me personally, just to learn and understand and know more, but also to see reality in a way that I never could before. So I want to thank the Lord for the opportunity to be part of this particular team. It's been a privilege.
Well, thank you both for what you're doing and the weight you're carrying and the team you're leading. And thank you for sharing with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Margaret. Appreciate it.